In this video, we're going to be getting the player controller using C++. By the end of it, we'll have the simple but important result that when we play the game, we have now, say, 3 AI tanks in the world, and if we look at the logs, we'll see that all 3 of them are finding us as a player controller. And we'll understand that from the context of this diagram, which I will build up for you, which explains how levels, world actors, player controller instances, game modes, and stuff all relate together. So I will see you in the video. So guys, what we want to do now is to implement this bit on the left. We have both the tank AI controller and the tank player controller finding the tank and reporting that they're possessing the relevant tank. Now we want to get to the bit where we can actually send a message through to the tank to aim at the player. So let's take a look at what that involves. Firstly, we need to understand how we're going to find the player controller. That is, the tank on this diagram on the left at the top needs to, an AI tank, needs to find the player tank. And in this case, there's only one player tank, but there could be more than one. So let's work it through. A world or level, which aren't exactly the same thing, but for now, let's consider them to be the same thing, has one or more actors in it like that. And those actors may be tanks, they may be, I don't know, lights, they could anything. They could be anything inside the world, that a barrel, it could be a chest, it could be anything. Right, but some of those actors are actually player controllers as well, are also actors. And of course, the tanks are actors. So what we've got is this world that's got a load of actors in it. For now, that's just 3 tanks, all of which are pawns, all of which are specialized to be tanks. And we have one player controller instance. We could have many, which is why I've drawn it like that with the stack. But at the moment, we only have one player controller. It's not a multiplayer game. It's a single human player, multi-AI player game. Okay, so there are going to be multiple AI controllers, but only one player controller. So that's the instance we're in. We have one player controller, which is possessing one of the tanks, and then the other tanks are possessed by something else, which we're not concerned about here, which is the AI controller. So how do they end up? How do these player controllers end up in the world? Well, what happens at construction is that the world or level specifies a game mode, which we've done. We've done it in a blueprint. And then that game mode specifies either a player controller C++ class or a player controller blueprint class. And in our case, we will end up with both, one parented on the other, which in turn instantiates the player controller instances as necessary. So it's important to remember that's the kind of sequence of events that goes on so that we know how to find our player controller. And if we couldn't find our player controller for some reason, you'd know to come back to this slide and look at it and work it through methodically to work out why. All right, cool. So now we've got this file. Let's go ahead and open our tank AI controller C++ class, and we're going to write another method, which is getPlayerTank. So we got getControlTank and beginPlay. By the way, by default, these things are private, despite what I may have said in a previous video. They're private by default, and so we may as well explicitly say that. And let's write a new method, which is aTankPointer getPlayerTank. And it's going to return, it's constant because it's not going to change anything. It's going to return a pointer to the player tank. So that's what we want to go and implement. Let's go ahead and write the implementation of that now. So use basically the same signature with, of course, the class name. Perfect. Okay, so how are we going to get the player tank? Well, there's a couple of different methods you can actually use for this, and I want you to have a look on the web and see if you can work out how to do it. I'm going to suggest that there'll be 2 things you'll find. You'll see the gameplay statics when you do a Google search. You'll also see this method here. So if you haven't got an internet connection or you don't want to look it up yourself, that's the method we need. Once you've got the first player controller like that, I want you to protect your pointer because maybe it'll fail, and then cast it to a tank, and then log out on begin play to check it worked. So you can replace the code that currently says I'm possessing a tank, and you could say, instead of that, using the same if structure in the begin play, we could say either I have or I haven't found a player tank. So rather than this AI controller reporting what tank it's possessing, it's going to report something very different, which is the player tank. Player 0 is a hint for you, which is player 0 in the game, the first player controller. All right, so good luck, and I'll see you in a minute, see if you can get that done. If you're struggling, as a recap, we're just trying to get the AI tanks to find and report which tank is the player tank. Okay, cool. So welcome back. How are we going to get this player tank then? Well, let's start off with auto player tank equals, and we'll go for this getWorld method, and then it's a pointer, so we need to use the arrow operator, get first player controller. Now, IntelliSense has not caught up with me yet, but that should be fine. So that gets us the player controller, and from the player controller, we want to get the pawn. I.e., we know that we are player 0, we are controlling that tank that's in the foreground, we want to get the pawn off that. Now, if not player pawn, I should call it player pawn, not player tank, because that's what it is. Then what do we want to do? We want to get out of here before we try and cast it. We get out of here by returning null pointer, because this method that we're in returns a pointer, expects a pointer coming back to a tank. But if it succeeds, we'll get this far. Then we'll return a cast, if you remember that, to a type of a tank, and it's the player pawn that we are casting. Just want to make a couple of notes on the code before we move on. Firstly, of course, on line 30, I should be saying if not player pawn, but this is a post-edit, so I can't fix that now. That gets done a tiny bit further on in the video. And the second thing is that the cast from player pawn to a tank, that cast will fail in the case that player pawn is a null pointer or an invalid pointer. So actually, strictly speaking, you could just return player pawn from here without all of these extra lines. And I'll be doing that in a few videos' time. But just in case you're wondering, yes, it is possible to just return player pawn. Okay, so that should, if we have properly declared this, y tank AI controller, a tank AI controller, that's the problem. Should have fallen into place now. Great. Then what I'm saying up here, instead of getting controlled tank, we're going to get player tank. So player tank, and then we'll just replace this stuff. Get player tank. If not player tank, report AI control can't find player tank. AI controller can't find player tank. But if we do manage to find the player tank, then we say the player tank is, or AI controller found player colon, that'll do, and instead of control tank, it's player tank name. You see what we're doing there? So we're going and getting the player tank and then reporting out what's going on. Let's try this. Before we even try and run it, let's check all this is set up right. So is the world or level, has it got the right game mode set? So you go to blueprints, battle tank game mode blueprint for this world. And what does it specify as a player controller? The player controller blueprint. Great. So from our diagram, that's this, specifying a blueprint class, which actually is in itself, if we look at the class, do we have a blueprint? Let me have a look. Yeah, the blueprint class is based on our tank player controller C++ class, which is flashing away over here. So we've got exactly this situation. It's that should be spawning the player controller instance. So hopefully this will work. Let's play the game and see if we get what we're looking for. So we seem to have the AI controller can't find the player tank. Well, why not? I don't know if you're getting this problem. You may not be. I'm not sure why I'm getting it. So let's follow the logic through. Let's go look at our code and see what may or may not be happening over there. So AI controller can't find player tank. We're getting to here, which means that we're seeing a not player tank. So if, look, I've missed the exclamation mark in front of player pawn. I was not saying if not player tank. I was just saying if player tank, return null pointer. So this was succeeding, and then we were returning a null pointer, which was coming up here and dropping through to here. I think that's what's happened. Let's see if that's what's happened. What a pain. Let's just take a look. So those semicolons, they're subtle and they're small, but they can totally invert the behavior of your game. Cool, look, the AI controller both of the AI controllers for the AI tanks found player BP_C_38. Let's just depossess the tank, go to the world outliner and check that that is indeed this tank. It is. Success. So the tanks can actually find the player now. That's great news. And if we were to drop a third tank into the world just for laughs and play, then we would have 3 of them all finding the same player. So that's pretty cool. Congratulations on getting that far. I'm just going to leave you with this diagram to remind you of the architecture. Take a little look at that, make sure it makes sense and you know where the checkboxes and buttons are inside the engine. And remember to commit your work over in the source control, as I have been for every single video, and I will see you soon.